one of the problems with Richard Dawkins is that people are argumentative about him. People either are for him or against him. And maybe one of the reasons for that is that he is such a propagandist in his own right. In other words, he believes his position to be so true and so important in relation to science that he's prepared to stand up for it forcefully. And he's constantly admonishing the reader for not facing up to the truth. Get rid of your old gods and wake up and follow the science. That would be a kind of general mood that you get from Dr. Dawkins, Professor Dawkins. And that's like putting what you're saying in a contentious context to start with. So there's a lot of what he says excludes people. It's not that he presents the details of natural selection and evolution and says, well, there you are, try and fit it into the way you see the world. He tends to point up the way you might be looking at the world, which is wrong. And the classic example of it is God. That's why his most famous book is called The God Delusion. And it's a provocative title because of course you're saying to people, billions of people who believe in God in different manifestations, whether Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist or Muslim, but you're saying to them, you're deluded. You're not saying that in some sense, I want to draw you out into a deeper understanding of science so that it will enrich you as a human being in your own faith. No, your faith is wrong. That's the first thing that I find interesting about him that kind of wears me out, that he has this ferociously confrontational way of dealing with his science. He's presenting it not, oh, look at this beautiful stuff. It's like, come up here, you bad people who are thinking the wrong ideas and clinging to very deluded notions of reality, and give them up, because this is the truth. And that's a really strong position. And it excludes me sometimes. There's a way he speaks about Christianity, mostly about Christianity, but I know that in other places he does it in relation to Islam. I know that I've seen videos where he starts to get going about Islam, and it's like you'd put your head under the desk if you were Muslim, in case he'd throw the duster at you. Sometimes he reminds me of the severity of a teacher. Now, he is a teacher, and he's a masterful teacher, and he's a masterful communicator, and he's a genius as a scientist. He's a genius. His capacity to understand stuff is like so far ahead of my ability to understand how a kettle boils, and he can understand how the universe works, and he can, and I'm not saying that with any amount of irony or satire or tongue-in-cheek or whatever. The guy is really seriously bright, gifted. But it's the way that he comes across at you. And I know the same thing used to happen with teachers. The way in the old days you'd have a teacher who was very, very cross with children, or very abusive to children in an emotional way, whereby the teacher would be kind of, telling them this is the truth. And he'd be like maybe furious with them, and maybe slapping them, maybe physically abusing them, for not learning their grammar or something. And the excuse made for a teacher like that would always be, well, he really worked at getting those young people educated, and maybe they were from a very poor area, and he knew what he was dealing with, and he knew the only way was to, to bait them. There was a teacher like that in my primary school. He was a Christian brother, and he was feared. We were terrified of him. Like, we really were terrified of him. As a child, you lived in fear. And the minutes ticked slowly in his class. And when it came to the point where you had him all day, he was your one teacher in senior class. He was your one teacher. And you dreaded going into that year, and when it began, your stomach was just churning with fear. From day one, at 9:30 in the morning, there you were, and you'd be listening to him, and you'd be terrified of him. And the argument made in his defence was that he got more scholarships into secondary schools for those kids, more than you could ever imagine. It was disproportionate to any other school in the county, the amount of kids from his school that were getting into secondary school. And they might have been, damaged emotionally in years afterwards. But that wasn't considered a huge price to pay in those days. It wasn't considered a huge price compared to the possibility that you would be educated. Because just back in 1966, when I went to secondary school, or even in the 6 or 10 years beforehand when that man was working as a teacher, you finished primary school, and most people, unless they were from the well-off professional classes at the edge of town, most people just went out the door and found maybe a job washing bottles in the local mineral water, or on the petrol pumps. It used to be a big thing in the 60s. And the teachers would even sneer and say things like, "Harding, you'll end up on the petrol pumps." But that one teacher, the defence was he was getting his students into secondary school. And I look back on the fear that I felt, and the fear that other people felt, and the damage that was done to children. I meet people, I have to say, I still meet people, not just from that school, but from all over the country, my age, who were damaged. And I'm not even talking about sexual abuse, which is another conversation, but I'm just talking about people who were damaged because their sense of confidence, their sense of peace, inner peace and joy was so disturbed when they were in primary schools, living in terror. And some of them were Christian brothers, but there was an equal amount of Christian brothers in my school who were really wonderful saints, caring, compassionate and gentle teachers. And also, it's true to say that some of the most ferocious of those crazy teachers who were physically abusing children in the 50s, 60s, were not religious at all, but were just secular school teachers in rural areas who had their own problems, very often from the abuse of drink, and were really demonic in class because, the alcoholic sees a child and they see something in the child that they hate because it's something in themselves that they hate. And God pity the child in that class when the teacher was going out and, tearing clumps of Sally bushes and breaking them into canes to come in and exercise himself when he was in a temper. The fella I'm talking about was pushing kids so that they would get into secondary school, so that they would do well in the final year exam that there used to be in those days in the primary school, believe it or not, to get a scholarship. There was, I think, 20 scholarships every year. Not many, was it? God almighty, it wasn't many. But I think that Dawkins reminds me of him. Dawkins, I wouldn't like to be in the room with him as a human being, because he seems so convinced. And it's not that, I know people who are, I know people who are masters of their trade, let's say. I know musicians who know so much about how the violin works and how the delicate way your finger can create a tone or a different type of note. And they know so many pieces of music, so many tunes, let's say. And you can sit with them and have a cup of tea with them, and they look at you and they smile at you and they say, "How are you doing?" And it's like their music is in their fingertips, but they're not putting it on you, they're not pushing it on you. You mightn't even know that they're a musician. You might be there looking at them and thinking, he's a very kind person. She's a really gentle human being, that woman. And maybe later somebody says, "Do you know she's a master of the cello? Do you know he plays the fiddle?" And you say, "God, I didn't know that." But it makes sense, because that there's something about kindness that comes out of this immersion in knowledge at a level of wisdom, that I keep talking about knowing things with the heart as well as the mind, as well as the brain. And you could, if you could learn something with your brain, like music, then it would be easy to create a whole lot of musicians the same way as you create engineers. But to some extent, you'll see the difference when you think about musicians, because they just, it's so innate to them, the sense of their music, that people say things like that it's in the family. And very often you find that it is in the family. But then you wonder, what do you mean it's in the family? Do you mean that it's some sort of clinical thing in the brain that can identify notes? Is it the ability to hear, middle C on the piano and be able to say with your ear, "That's middle C," or "That note is flat, you're not playing that note right"? Is that it? It's completely a physical thing of the brain? Or is it the way that the heart absorbs the sense of music? Or is it just accidentally? Somebody said to me one time that if you want your child to play music, you need to play it yourself. You want them to take up the fiddle, make sure you have a fiddle in the house. And I remember at the time, I wouldn't have a great gift of music now, but I loved the flute. I love Irish music and any kind of music. But I got a tin whistle and then I got a flute. And I did workshops in the Mooney School. And there the flute would be sitting there and I'd be practicing it. And the child was 3 and 4 years of age. And sure enough, once she came to, let's say, the first or second year in primary school, she got into playing the tin whistle, and she used to love it so much that she'd practice it in the mornings before she'd go out to school. And myself and the lady wife would be sitting down. We used to enjoy the sound of it. We'd be thinking, isn't it an amazing thing? Aren't we blessed to be living in rural Ireland, and we're not, we're not rushing to jobs on trains or buses or cars. We're not worried about the rush hour traffic. And we're here sitting boiling an egg, and we're listening to somebody playing a tune on a whistle who happens to be our daughter. And it's like, that's the good life. And I think that there is possibly that connection in music, that it's in some way you're very deeply following another human being, but not for technical reasons, but like it's a very spiritual connection that you have with your mother or your father. And so you see them kind of making this music, which in itself is like a religious ritual. It's like a prayer. Singing. It's like a prayer. Praising. Expressing joy. And something in it transmits to you at the level of the heart. So that's what I think. And I think that in the teaching of stuff, any of the musicians I've ever met, masterful musicians, they don't have an evangelical urge. They don't look at you with a serious face saying you should be playing music. Even though one time when I got that flute, I went to Steve Wickham, who is a friend, and I hugely admire him again. He plays with the Water Boys, and he plays with No Crows, and he plays on his own, and he plays with loads of famous musicians, and he's a guy that, he used to come to us socially sometimes about 20 years ago, and he'd come into the house. He'd always bring the fiddle with him. He'd be coming in for a coffee. And he'd walk into the kitchen and he'd have the old fiddle in the box, And he'd say to me, we'll play a few tunes. And I wouldn't want to be playing tunes, because I'm no good. So my sense of my ability would be making me stressed. If he comes and he has the fiddle and he starts playing a tune, I'm going to be stressed trying to play with him. I wasn't getting into the freedom of sharing the joy, which is what he was at, really. He was just coming for a cup of coffee, but the most, normal thing for him was the intrinsic relationship between that coffee, meeting you, meeting me, and celebrating in the joy of opening the buckles on the case and taking out the fiddle and playing a tune. And he'd be playing a tune sometimes between sips of his mug of coffee. And it was like he didn't and he doesn't have any sense of evangelical importance. It's just like, well, if you play and I play, let's play it together. And all the musicians I've met have been like that. I've just never met a musician that was evangelical. I'm using the word evangelical from the Christian tradition. You know what I mean. It's that sense of, I need to tell you this, I need to push this on you. And to be honest with you, I do that all the time. I'm talking about how beautiful a life is where somebody is not evangelical. And I have to admit, it's a fault of mine all the time. I'm constantly pontificating and I'm constantly preaching. And it might be about music, or it might be about prayer, or it might be about Islam, or it might be about Christianity. But, I'm just constantly doing it. And sometimes when I was younger at the dinner table, that was the big issue that I feel would turn you off if you were listening to me. You'd be saying, we'll not be inviting him again, because I'd be talking too much. And a lot of the talking was preaching. It may even have been what drew me into the priesthood, the sense that, it would give me a pulpit. The idea, the template, the image of priest that may have unconsciously attracted me might have been the image of the guy in the pulpit, Here is an institution where you can, go for it. Day in, day out, you can just preach to the world. I don't know now about that. It's just come into my head as another possible factor in how much I've been deluded all my life. But I certainly was a talker, and I used my talk to convince other people of ideas. And what made the difference for me was discovering in myself a storyteller, and to a great extent discovering in my mother that she was a storyteller, and then realizing that, well, what she does, actually, I do as well. What's in the cat comes out in the kitten. She has a way of gossiping that is fascinating, and she can hold the attention of a room for 2 or 3 hours. I saw her doing it for years. Even as she was getting old, she could still, when people my age, when we were in our 30s and 40s, and I'd bring them into the house and the mother would be there, 40 years older than them, or 35 anyway, and she'd get them going because they were interested in her stories. Now, it was called gossip, and she'd always have a kind of a sharp tongue to cut through some body that she knew, that we all knew, But she certainly was like a great storyteller, and she would hold the attention of the room for a long time. And I saw it in her. I used to sit there thinking, Jesus, will she ever shut up? But then I began to realize, she has a talent. And then I realized, well, I have the same talent. I go on like that too. And then I discovered that telling stories makes you more friends than preaching. And I discovered, for example, and I often do this when I'm doing workshops on the art of memoir, I do say to people, look at the way you sit around a table. When you're having a dinner party, if you talk politics or if you talk religion, you will divide the table. If you put a huge amount of effort into buying good Bordeaux wine and getting a very fine roast or a beautiful vegetarian dish, and there it is on the table, and you've put all this work into it, and your guests are there, they've come a long way, and they're all sitting around, and then at the last minute, just as you're beginning to sit and eat, you say something like, what do you think of Brexit? Or what do you think of the Queen's Jubilee? And you divide the table, because the only way that goes is that there will be some people for the idea and against it. And Brexit and the Queen's Jubilee are minor compared to the serious issues that you could get going on. Now, I know that there are some tables nowadays where young people sit around and they do talk politics, but they talk it in a way where everybody is on the same side. That to me is very curious. That maybe a conversation at the chattering classes would be discussing, diversity, inclusion, racism, white supremacy, whatever. But in those conversations when they come up at the dinner table, and this would be, I think, particularly among young people, there's no space for any disagreement. So that becomes just boring, because the whole dinner party then becomes a way, it's like a check-in that we all are on the right side of the ideology. In the old days, at least, everything always had two sides. If you discussed the most sensitive subjects, let's say the armed struggle of the IRA, or the violence in Russia, prisons in China, whatever you discussed, there was always for and against, or there was always against and for. There was always somebody at the table who'd say, well, I think that the Chinese are holding the whole society together and taking people out of poverty. So it would never be just one way. And that's good in university, and I think that is what universities used to be. They used to call it, in my time, discourse. So discourse was this idea that you would have the two sides of any argument had to be played out. And in Tibet, in the universities, the Tibetan universities in southern India, which I have been to many years ago, you'd see the young students in the evening in the courtyard being paired by the professors into couples, into twos, and then they would be asked to defend some philosophical proposition, one guy, and the other guy would be asked to propose, to defend it and attack it. So they would have these debates in the courtyard, and the debates had these gestures. You'd often see them in videos of Tibetan monks, where they're these strange kind of gestures of moving their hands in the air and banging their hands together. And these were kind of physical gestures that attended the arguments you were making. And the ritual was about testing the student's ability to be the protagonist for an idea or the antagonist, to argue for the proposal or to argue against the proposal. And it was called discourse, and it was the way that you kind of got to know an idea. And it follows through in all the debating societies in universities across the world, where any unspeakable subject will be put up, that this house supports the armed struggle of the IRA, let's say. And it's debated, for and against. Even, let's say, that this house supports that this house, let's say, condemns the atrocities committed by Germany during the Second World War. And it's debated, which means that obviously somebody gets up and rightly talks about the atrocities of, Auschwitz and all that happened in the Holocaust. But the debate is not complete unless you find somebody to argue against, even though that's kind of sacrilegious to step over into that idea that you would defend the indefensible. It's still something that was seen or is seen as a way of discourse, as discussing ideas in university. And I think perhaps that's where Professor Dawkins comes from. I think he comes from so deeply in the academic world that he is used to forceful argument, that it is normal and right for him to be making the argument forcefully, even though it kind of upsets me. I'm not a professional here, I'm not a scholar, not an academic. So I find it intimidating, but it would seem to me that he does it forcefully. I'd be taking umbrage. I'd be getting very personal, like, oh, he's offending my faith, like the way he's dismissing Christianity. But in actual fact, he's rightly coming out of a tradition of discourse within university life that understands the need to put forward the argument in a forceful manner, and then somebody else, the opponent of the idea, will put the opposite argument just as forcefully. Now, I was saying that one of the things that divides a dinner table is politics or ideas that people disagree about. And where I found my way forward was that people love stories. So from being a real bore at a dinner party, where not even a bore, I don't think I was a bore, I think it just annoyed people. But being on that side of a very unloved person, because they were always stirring trouble at dinner parties, I became the most loved person in the room, because I realised, listen, this is simple. Don't be bringing up politics. Don't be bringing up religion at a dinner table. Tell some lovely story. Tell about, if you met somebody interesting in the gala shop yesterday and you had a good old chat with them, tell the story. And people really love a story. And it was Tom McIntyre who told me one time, very wisely, he said, always remember, people love a story, but the only real story that they just adore is the love story. That is the supreme, above all else, the love story. And I very often, when I'm writing books, when I'm talking about whether it's my mother or this one or that one, I always try and tell it as a love story, because that is the story that's most interesting to people. And as a craft person, as a teller of stories, I just want, it's like if I made shoes, I'd want them to fit you. If I tell stories, I want them to fit your heart. I want them to fit your emotions, so that you kind of buy into it. And that's the storyteller. And the story, funny enough, and the idea that the love story was the best story to tell, it's like maybe a tailor is making suits, and eventually he discovers that wool is the best material to be using. So he comes to appreciate wool in itself. For me, because I started telling the love story, I think a strange thing happened to me, and that is that the more I talked about love, the more love grew inside me. So I awoke to how loving I could be as a human being, because I was embodying love in the telling of stories. Whereas all the time when I was preaching religion, talking about Christianity off the pulpit, I was only sharing something intellectual. And then I begin to see that that's what the musician does as well. And that's what the artist does, the one who is in love, My same old teacher, Tom McIntyre, he said, you can't write unless you're in love. Not just to write a love story, but you need to be in love yourself. And I think that all the musicians I've ever met who play beautifully are in love. All the writers who write beautifully. All the people I meet who tell stories are telling the stories because the story is embodying their love. And it's not like, if I say I have love in my heart, it is not necessarily that I'm telling you the story about me and the beloved. It's that I have love in my heart as a capacity to meet the beloved in whoever I meet. Whoever turns up by accident in the cafeteria. Whoever sits down beside me on a public bench in Bundoran is the beloved. In this moment, here comes the whole universe in its conscious manifestation as human looking into my eyes. That's no less than the beloved. So all that I found out makes me who I am, but it also makes me the person who, when I listen to Richard Dawkins, I can admire him. I can understand what he's saying most of the time, but he scares the shit out of me like he was that terrifying teacher and I was like in 6th class. He makes me feel bad. He frightens me with his forcefulness. And even though I say that, I know that his forcefulness is validated. It is valid by virtue of his tradition and his scholarship and the fact that he lives in a university and academic world. In other words, if you don't like the heat, get out of the kitchen. And if you don't like that forceful way of talking, just get out of the university. Or get out of Richard Dawkins' hair. Because I'm telling you, if you tangle with him, you need to be up for it. Because he'd chew you up. And it's okay. That's what I'm saying, it's okay. I'd find it okay. If I was ever in a room with him, I'd be terrified, but I'd keep my mouth shut. Now, just kind of to round off, because I promised this as a meditation on Richard Dawkins. And I found during the week that I was listening to him. I read a book called Outgrowing God. And that's a very fine book. And I listened to it on audio, and I was trying to get some way into the ideas in it, the intellectual ideas in that book. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to do this because I'm not a scholar. And this podcast has always been about story. It's always been about me telling you, sharing with you my story. And again, it was only at the last minute, it was only last night that I realised the way to do this podcast about Dawkins that you have promised to do is share the confusion and the emotional response you have to Dawkins as a person when you listen to him. And I would do that with the one exhortation that he's worth reading or listening to, because if you get over his nastiness when it comes to Christian faith or Muslim faith, and I think he's nasty now about both, I have to say. He has a way of saying it that's actually small-minded, He says things sometimes that he's trying to be reductive about Christianity. He's trying to make it sound like it's small, But I'm always reminded of the adage that when you try and reduce somebody like that, you're only reducing yourself. And it's like him that sounds petty. I'll give you an example. He talks about, there's three big ideas he has. One is that evolution is from bottom up, not top down. That's one big idea. Another big idea he goes on about is the God of the gaps, as being the kind of God that we believe in, and that it's absurd and silly. And the third one, which is, I think, is most interesting on the subject of not just evolution, because the conversations have now moved in physics to the beginning of the universe. Right? So just let me, now this is only off the top of my head, but let me say about those three areas. The first one is clear enough. You're talking, he beautifully describes, he's a powerful biologist, and he holds all his knowledge lightly, and he can explain in very lovely simple terms how organisms evolve complexity. You know, the organism is simple, then it becomes complex. And that evolution over 13.8 billion years of the cosmos gives us the complex world we have because it has evolved like this. It's evolved towards complexity. The refinement of a tiny little difference, talks about, let's say, the tiger, and he has a claw, and just a tiny difference, maybe a tiger is born with a larger claw, and makes him more effective in finding food, makes him more effective in running. So that slight difference is assured to be incorporated in the genes that follow on in the next generation, because that particular advantage that tiger has will ensure that he gets a partner, that he has baby cubs, and that they grow up, and then they'll be there with their little extra claw or whatever. This is a very simplistic way of saying it now. But that is the way that the kind of evolution works towards a complexity and diversity from simple organisms. And he rightly illustrates then that an idea of God as from the top, having like blueprints, given all these blueprints, and all the blueprints being scattered around the place in various animals. It's a silly idea. So there he goes arguing, it's all bottom up. It all just comes from simple things becoming more complicated. And that, he says, proves the absurdity of holding to the idea of a God, which is like a big complex idea, and that God is sort of, top down, giving us all this stuff. He's right about that, The only thing about this is, it's like, I don't know, is it called a paper tiger or a straw man? He's setting up something anyway that, sure, you'd totally agree with him. You'd be saying to yourself, well, sure, if that's the model we're taking of God, sure, you're right. Okay. No bother to you. And another one he goes on about is the idea that when we don't know something, we tend to mythologize. Starts off, he talks about people, early humans on the plains of Africa, and they're in the long grass and they hear a noise and they don't know whether it's a tiger or not. Now, if they presume it's not a tiger all the time, they'll usually get eaten whenever the tiger is there. On the other hand, if the propensity is to say it might be a tiger, so they hear a little rustle in the leaves or the long grass, and they say, that's a tiger. Even though they may be wrong, half the time, it's still a better mechanism for survival. So the propensity to see causality where there is no causality, and to see the causality attached to a kind of a mythological presence, like it's the tiger, that's a good survival mechanism. And he would say that it's in that kind of stuff that you get the very primitive origination of religion. But he says what happens is, just as the guy in Africa learns that's the sound of grass rustling, it's the wind, it's not a tiger. So his knowledge begins to say, okay, that's okay, definitely no tiger there. In the same way, we think primitively, listen to the thunder. That must be God. He must be very angry because that's a fierce noise in the sky. Sure, it couldn't be anybody else but God. And then when you find out and figure out that the thunder might be the noise that comes from the electrical explosion in the lightning, say, oh, that's what it is. It's not God. God has to withdraw, if you like, from the thunder. Because we cannot, because we learn what the thunder is, so we know it's not God. But if there's some other thing where there's a gap in our knowledge, we call it God. And that becomes the God of the gaps. The God of the gaps is where you have a gap in your knowledge, a gap in your science, and you put God in. And again, he's right. You'd be saying to yourself, I can understand that. I can understand that, primitive people heard a knock on the door and they thought it was, a ghost, or they heard the thunder up in the sky and they thought it was God, and so on and so forth. I can understand that. Fine. But again, the funny thing is, he's setting up an argument against a God that you don't really believe in anyway. I don't believe in God like that at all. If that's what God is, then that it's a sort of a name you put to explain what you don't know. Sure. That's a delusion. Now, the third area that he's very good on is just the idea of where the universe originated. And what he says about this is, and this is really still discussed now by scientists, by physicists, to be wondering why the fine-tuning at the very beginning of the Big Bang. So now we all agree that there's a Big Bang. We all agree actually that the universe began. And I didn't know this, but 100 years ago, the supposition was that the universe was kind of static. So when Einstein was talking about relativity, and there was a huge amount of work done, and evolution of the species, that had all been kind of taken on board, but they still thought about the universe as kind of static. And I don't know the science around this, but they came to a certain consensus then that it was actually the Big Bang, that the Big Bang is the working model that really is the most plausible, the one we have to live with. So the Big Bang meant, okay, so it all came out of one singularity. And this singularity, this one single spot, dot, spatial moment, is like the beginning. So, right, well, what was there before the beginning? And also consider that the measurements of things like gravity, the reality of gravity, the reality of the speed of light, the physical measurements that it took to create this universe, who put them in place? Because if one of those was just a digit off, and I'm talking about measurements that are like, he gives an example. He says, if you could imagine a clock with digits on it, like for measurements, like a measuring kind of a gauge, and imagine there were so many little strokes, points on the gauge, that it numbered the same amount of seconds that have existed since the beginning of the universe. Now that's 13.5 billion years. So how many seconds are there in 1 year, in 1,000,000 years, in 1,000,000,000 years? How many seconds in 13.8 billion years? That's a lot of little dots on a dial. Imagine there's a dial with that amount of dots in it, 360-degree circle. and imagine that there are certain measurements that are so precise in relation to physics that if you moved the dial one digit, then the cosmos wouldn't have existed, or it wouldn't have evolved in the way that it has. And those kind of what they call fine-tuning of the cosmos before the Big Bang, how is it that when this Big Bang happened, it followed rules that had to be predetermined? They have to be, these are the rules, these are the kind of tuning digits that create this. And a lot of people then, a lot of scientists would say, well, there's nowhere for it to come from if you're saying that the Big Bang is the beginning of material. If it's the beginning of the material universe, then there's no way that you can avoid speculating about a mind prior to the reality of the physical that determines the measurements within which the physical will exist. I didn't know we were there, you know. I found that actually exciting, and I got animated about maybe the plausibility of this notion of the existence of God from physics. I thought, wow. Although to me it's just poetry. It's an utterly beautiful poem to think about the cosmos like this. It's like, how can my little mind get around it? But it's pleasurable sometimes to actually think about it. The effect it has on me is not that I feel I'm grasping some sort of knowledge about the universe, but it's like an exercise that it relativizes my human condition, the shortness of my life, and the importance of being in love. That's what it does to me. When I think about the size of the cosmos, I think I want to be in love more often. I want to be in love every second. I want to let go of all my anxieties because they're of no importance. If the universe is that big. Now, when Dawkins is talking about that fine-tuning argument, he doesn't use the phrase fine-tuning. You know, he doesn't say, well, the fine-tuning that they claim should be there. He talks about there being some somebody twiddling the dials. Twiddling the dials. And of course you immediately get an image of, you know, your father at the old radio set, endlessly twiddling the dial and never getting it fucking right, you know. You'd hear him passing across Athlone 3 or 4 times, Athlone being the Irish radio station in the 30s and 40s and 50s. But, and he'd be twiddling the dial. And you'd hear, you know, the sound of the sound of an old radio set. And there he is twiddling it. And it's like an old Egypt. So, like, what's interesting to me is that Dawkins would put his finger on that image when he's speaking about fine-tuning. Now, fine-tuning is a scientific, speculative position that many serious physicists adhere to as the most plausible. And they recognize that it creates a problem that it is plausible to lead you into speculation about the idea that there's a mind, an a priori mind, before the first moment of matter. Dawkins talks about it as like somebody twiddling the dial, you know, to get the measurements right. And while it is a fabulously strong and sharp image that works, nonetheless, there's something in it which is reductive and makes me uneasy, because it feels to me like when you use that kind of caricature, you're pushing the argument more to promote yourself rather than the truth. You've got an investment in it that reveals itself with a sharp, and I mean an emotional investment, not an intellectual one, but there's a sharpness starts to come out of you. And that happens an awful lot with Dawkins, I find. And he's good at it because he's good at language, you know. He's a master of that as well. So he can come up with some fabulously good images, caricature images, reductive images, when he wants to illustrate what to him is the offensive nature of religion. And he doesn't spare the horses. He gets the argument going and lashes into what he thinks are foolish or wrong positions. And he does it very often in a way that's reductive and is so good, it's so accurate, but yet there's just this little flavour of almost kind of sneering. Now, if you're me, like the child in the classroom, you're feeling, I'm being laughed at. And that's the way I'd feel with Dawkins. If I was in a room with him, I would feel very inadequate about my faith. And I don't know why I should feel that. I mean, I'm a human being, the same as him. I should have the same dignity. And in some sense, there needs to be a way to persuade me, you know, that you can add evolution and you can add all the scientific stuff to me. You can give it to me as a gift, wisdom or knowledge. You can give it to me as a gift without destroying me. And here's the way to do that. And here is finally, and I'll finish up on this, but here is finally the way I kind of part company with Dawkins. You see, I live in a world where I had left the institutional church, the Catholic Church. I'd studied a certain amount of Buddhism to give me a kind of practice, which I really mostly discovered as a psychotherapy. I was doing something to keep myself calm, to keep myself in a healthy mental state, and I found it worked. And then I went back and had another look at the Christian thing within the context of my Buddhism, if you like, within the context of saying, look, let's stop believing all this as evangelical truth that you want to, you know, bait people over the head with it about God or Jesus, and just see, does it work for you, actually? You know, see, does it make you a better person, that you're more here, more present? And I always used the be here now phrase because Thich Nhat Hanh used it, and it seems to me a very suitable way of talking about everything in the whole Buddhist tradition, in all the sutras. Everything is contained in just be here now. So that became my way to be at peace. And then I says to myself, well, I wonder could I use the Christian stuff, me old-fashioned stuff, the old favourites that I was reared with, could I use them? Not to prove something, not to find like God or heaven, but just to be here now. And this was a totally new way to use Christian faith, and this is what this podcast, I think, is all about, to be honest with you. It's a new take on the Christian faith. And I found the rosary, meditation, prayers, reflecting on icons particularly, doing private little rituals, and not even going to churches. I don't go to churches. I ascribe to any particular community or group or whatever, but I feel a sense of Eucharistic unity and belonging with all Christians. In fact, with all people who are even not Christians. Because once you get what I'm saying about Christianity, that it is a way of being here now, then when you're standing shoulder to shoulder with somebody of the Islamic faith or Jewish faith, you're still present with them. You're here now. Be here now is what is like. It works with everybody. And embodying that sense of awakened presence, compassionate presence with other people, that's what relativizes all philosophy. It relativizes all truth. You see suddenly that all that Christian stuff is not absolute. It's absolute for you if it works to bring you into the heaven of being here and now. If taking the Holy Eucharist, embodying the presence of Christ at the Holy Mass, allows you afterwards to go to the cafe and sit down with your friend and then see that one of your enemies, some neighbour you don't like, comes in and sits close by, and you're able to say hello to them and maybe bring them over and share a little scone with them and have a coffee with them. If that's what it does, if it helps you more intensely to be here now, then it was a really, really good thing to go to Mass. If it excludes you from other people, if a differentiation begins to evolve that, well, I don't sit with you anymore in the cafe because you're not a Catholic. Oh, that to me is not working. And on the whole subject of differentiation, sometimes I find people who have an ideology, post-religious ideology, or people who have a scientific faith, that they believe in science. Sometimes they're the worst. Sometimes they're the ones who really don't want to sit with you because they look at you and they're saying, well, you're different because you're still hanging on to God. And I think Dawkins is in that camp of, he does a bit too much differentiation for my comfort. If he was sitting in the restaurant or the cafe and I was at another table, I wouldn't entirely be excited about going over to him and saying, how are you doing? Read your book. I'd leave him alone because I'd be afraid he'd ask me, and what kind of books do you read or write? And when I'd be finished telling him that, he'd want to leave the restaurant. Now, in real life, of course, he won't be like that at all. He'd be a kind, compassionate person who'd sit down with everybody. And I bet you he has loads of friends who are really close to him and that he loves from all sorts of different religious traditions. No doubt about it. I would say far more than me. He lives a big life in a university and traveling the world with his books. Of course he'd have an amazing amount of connections and people that he would love. So I get it that in real life, you could be talking about a very, very compassionate, holy and wonderful person. But when I listen to him on his videotapes, or when I listen to his audiobooks, or when I read him, I find his arguments are exclusionary. They keep me out. They're reductive to my faith. They make me feel bad about my faith. And sometimes his caricatures and his almost sneering energy against historical people within my tradition that I revere makes me uneasy. I know it's to do with the fact that we're talking intellectual discourse of universities. I understand it, and I think it's completely valid, and I'd far prefer to have that sort of acerbic argumentative discourse in universities than to have the monolithic one point of view universities that we tend to go towards now with the kind of modern ideologies in the West. So there you are. I am conflicted about Professor Dawkins, but the bottom line is, when I read him, he challenges my faith, and that in some way strengthens my faith. And even when he makes me uneasy, as he does, I think it's good for me. It prevents me from being smug, and it keeps challenging me as a Christian and as somebody who believes in God's presence. It keeps challenging me to recognize that he may be right and I may be very wrong. That's what I dealt with in a podcast about what is real. I'm only using my faith, my religious faith, to be here, to be present. And it may be that he, as a more enlightened person, is more accurately describing the nature of the world, and that God is just a delusion. And that may upset me, it may make me feel uneasy, but it's not really what I'm about. I'm not ever trying to prove there's a God. I'm only saying that by following the path, the faithful path of religion, it allows me to be here now, to be present. And being fully present, if I was sitting in the room with Richard Dawkins, would be to acknowledge him and love him and accept that his ideas may be absolutely correct, may be right, or they may be just right for him. You'll never get to the bottom of it, but I found it really, really an amazing week of trying to figure him out and trying to grasp some of his ideas. Forgive me, I'm not a physicist, I'm not a scholar, and I may have made a terrible country effort to put across some of his ideas. I'd recommend have a look at him on YouTube, listen to some of his books. He's a lovely voice, he's a lovely civilized and gentle way of speaking. You'd enjoy listening to him anyway. And just enjoy him, listen to him, and let the stuff go into your heart and see what it does to you. Thank you so much for being here. It's the June bank holiday. We're going to be going towards midsummer. I'm going to be getting fierce excited about that in the next week or two on the podcasts. So enjoy the bank holiday, and bye-bye.